Good morning again. Thank you so much for your patience. We are about to get started with our next session. So I will introduce to you your moderator for this next session, Dr. Danny Davis. So thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's not afternoon yet?
No, it's still morning. 25 more minutes.
Fine. I know we were a little behind schedule, so I thought maybe it was afternoon by now, so I stand corrected. Ladies and gentlemen, we are a bit behind schedule, and in your schedule you will see that the 3 speakers in this section today would deem to be virtual. There's been a slight change. They are now going to be via Zoom. Okay, so which means that gives you an opportunity to have a few questions if you so desire. So with that, then I'll introduce our first speaker, Dr. Michelle Wallace-Rencher. Dr. Rencher is a native of Nassau, Bahamas, who has earned a reputation for being a consummate change agent, having led large programs, organizational campaigns in the largest and oldest retailers in the Bahamas, the largest healthcare system in the US, Nissan Global, and the state of Tennessee. Dr. Wallace-Rencher is the daughter of Jesslyn and the late Mike Wallace, both veterans. That echo is very disconcerting. Both veteran educators in the Bahamas, and their example has supported the completion of her bachelor's, master's, and PhD degree in organizational leadership. She is the wife, mother, and proud Bahamian, as evidenced in her dissertation focused on examining effective leadership within the Bahamian public sector and its role in mitigating the brain drain. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Rencher will be talking to us today. Her title is Decolonization of Education in the Bahamas.
Dr. Danny and everybody else, good morning. But before I begin, unfortunately, my camera is not enabled. So if I could get some tech support, I'd greatly appreciate it to be able to start my video. On my end, apparently the video has been stopped by the host. Well, in the essence of time, I am going to dive right into our discussion, and hopefully somewhere along the journey, I'll be able to share my smile with you because I am beyond excited to be with you today. Not only am I a native Bahamian, as you just heard, I am the daughter of veteran educators. And so anything about education is something that is near and dear to my heart. And today I am excited to join in our discussion as we talk about the decolonization of education. I did notice another panelist discuss the similar topic, same topic yesterday, and he and I went to the same primary school. So I'm hoping that in the audience, he will actually get a little bit of something of what I have to say today. So as I dive into my discussion, I need you to know a little bit about who I am and how who I am shapes the way I think and the way I believe that we need to handle education in the future. So first of all, my name, again, as you know, is Michelle Wallace-Rencher. My first name is after my father, the late Michael Wallace. My middle name is Simone, which is after my mother's favorite singer-songwriter, the legendary truth teller, Nina Simone. My last name is hyphenated because I always want to bring homage to my ancestors. And I am married, I have children, and as such, they come along with me for the journey. And so as we begin our discussion, I want to make certain that you guys understand my understanding of colonization. Colonization means to take control of a people, an area, a community. It also means to capture, to disconnect, to disenfranchise, and even to de-identify. For many Bahamians, including my parents and so many generations before them, who were born in a colonized Bahamas, decolonization commonly means to liberate, to regain control of, to reclaim, to honor, to recognize, and even to identify and celebrate our lived truths. The previous panelists spoke about denying information, denying the truths of Bahamians, and I truly agree with that. And so today, as we share my topic, the decolonization of education, I want to carry you on a little journey. I want to make certain that you not only understand my perspective, but that you learn something about me and the generations before me and how education played a really big part in who we are and how the colonization of education shaped a lot of who we are today. And the participants in my narrative are going to be my family, my parents, my grandparents, and even a little bit about me. And so again, decolonization of education begins on the island of Eleuthera with my ancestors, my two grandfathers. William Bill Wallace and Jeremiah Clark were both born in the same quaint settlement of Savannah Sound, Eleuthera. In Eleuthera, both of these young men grew up. They attended the all-age school that was supported by the local monitors under the guidance of the then Board of Education. So in the colonized Bahamas of the 1930s, this simply meant that they were denied certain levels of education. While they did have the one-room school, their experience when it came to education would have been limited, especially their education when it came to understanding the complexity of who their ancestors were. And in many cases, their limitation of education meant they were limited by time. So they were only allowed to attend school for a certain amount of time. It meant that you only had a certain amount of information to retain during that amount of time. Now, once they both migrated into Nassau, as was the case in many men of the day, they would migrate into Nassau, the big city, looking to find their fortune. They both got married, raised families. My one grandfather, Bill Wallace, actually became an entrepreneur, very successful in his way, had multiple businesses. My other grandfather, Jeremiah Clark, worked in both the public and in the private sectors. Now, while their professional paths were very different, their commonalities lied in their recognizing very early on that there were limitations as to what they could do and who they could be because of the amount of education that they were actually exposed to. And as a result of that, they were very committed and focused to making certain that their children and eventually their grandchildren would be educated. And so while they were very different, the commonalities were definitely strong, and it was strong throughout my family lineage. Now, as we all know, the journey from colonization through majority rule, through liberation and independence, and eventually to where we are today, months away from celebrating 50 years of independence, has been a long road. But let's be clear, colonization may have had its limits. It placed limits on the access to quality education. It diminished the capacity to achieve. Decolonization, however, does support a more inclusive educational system. It does speak about having relevancy when it comes to curriculum, and it also seeks to inspire and, of course, even to encourage. And so while I began this discussion, while I began doing some research, because in my workspace, in my current world, I am working in the research world. I work in technology, and I'm always having to understand what's next, what's on the cutting edge. I'm deeply immersed in AI in my current space. But as I prepared, I wanted to understand the lived truth. I didn't want to get just family lore and some narrative. I wanted to understand somebody else's lived truth who would be a part of my dynamic. And I wanted to gain, as I mentioned earlier, bring my family along on this journey. And in doing that, I wanted to make certain that my mother's story be a part of our discussion today. So I asked her what her experiences were being raised in Nassau, having attended Weston Junior, Weston Senior, and even the government high school. And so my mother shared with me how she was profusely discouraged from STEM subjects. Now I say STEM, that's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Typically subjects that I was heavily immersed in through my entire career so far. And yet my mother was discouraged because of when and where she was born. Now, even though she was discouraged from those topics, what she was encouraged to study, and the counter to that, was needlework and home economics. And she was told, and she remembers quite vehemently, how important it was for her to know how to hem a skirt and how to make scones, as was the common practice of the day by the teachers who were, of course, European. She also shared with me how she was extremely passionate about getting towards science. And even though she was discouraged, she did find a way in the back of the classroom. She did find and make her way to eventually understanding and being completely immersed in the science industries. And so, as we know, as with most good stories, there has to be some kind of happily ever after. And so, despite the discouragement, despite being told profusely that she should not even pursue science and mathematics, that there was no point to it, both of my parents went on to study science at the University of the West Indies. My mother, after a number of years, after obviously going into becoming a wife and mother, it took her a number of years to get back into the academic rigors, but she did, and she completed her studies. So much so that she actually received the only distinction from the Bahamas at the University of the West Indies the year that she studied. And so she went on further to not only study at that time and absorb what she could, but she was passionate about making certain that others of that world, of her Bahamian experience, would be taught the importance of understanding mathematics and science as critical thinkers. She became a high school mathematics teacher, and she also taught as an adjunct professor at the College of the Bahamas. Now, while people may definitely argue the merits of the benefits of STEM subjects versus home economics and literature and other topics that are very different from math and science, I think it is extremely important to notice that within the narrative of the Bahamas, within the reality of what was happening back then, there is still a very big disparity in what's happening today. And so the journey from colonization until today, while it has been a long one, my family's narrative has been a very journeyed one, very interesting to say the least. But my journey has to be a part of the narrative because, again, I am here today with you, and it's important that we talk about not only what happened back in the day, but what is happening possibly today. And so before we get to today, I have to tell you how I experienced colonization. Now, unfortunately, my camera's still not working, so I can't share with you that I do have gray roots. And so I am actually the age of my country. I'm one of those people who were born in the shadows of Bahamian independence. And so I'm totally excited to be a part of that narrative of when the Bahamas turns 100 years old, I want to be there. Because unfortunately, I was a baby on Clifford Park in 1973. And as a baby, you didn't go very far because your parents didn't take you. But nonetheless, my grandfather, Jeremiah Clark, was a police reservist. And he was serving in capacity, getting ready to go ahead and make that parade on Clifford Park on the night of 1973. I was an infant at home asleep in my grandmother's bed in Chippenham, as the family story goes. And so while it's so important, the narrative for me is, utterly breathtaking. And my grandfather, apparently, according to the family legend, woke me up and looked in my eyes. And he told my mother that he wanted to see the future in my eyes, that I was going to see freedom the same night that he would. This is a man who was born in 1919. And he recognized how important it was that we would see the same thing at the same time. But less than 2 weeks later, he took ill very suddenly. But before he passed away, he also declared to my mother how important it was that I would be educated. Now, in my family, I am not the first grandchild. I'm not even the last grandchild. I'm somewhere smack in the middle. But for some reason, that story has always sat heavily with me. It made me recognize the importance, as Bob Marley says, we have to emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. And none of us can free ourselves. So we must all be a part of the conversation. And so way back when in 1973, 50 years ago, almost 50 years to the actual timeline, a few weeks away from it, my grandfather spoke to my mother and gave her a declaration. She and my father took it seriously. They made every possible effort to make certain that from Chippenham, I was transported back and forth to Queens College. I was taken back and forth to St. John's in preparation for my O-level examinations. Because as we know, back in the day, O-levels were the creme de la creme of being somebody in Bahamian society. Now, you may wonder, even with my parents' big efforts to get me to and from QC, I know many persons in yesterday's discussion were QC comets. Well, I'm not only am I a QC comet back in the day, but I'm also a St. John's Jolly Green Giant. And so it's important that I share with you how I was touched by colonialism. You see, when I entered 7th grade in the Bahamas had just turned 10 years old. And while we were celebrating and a lot of things were happening and there was getting ready for CHOGM and all these things, amazing things were happening in the country, the area that I recognized now, but that I was actively immersed in, was education. And so as a 7th grader in St. John's, I just left Queens College, going into St. John's, a community that was closer to where I lived in Chippenham. There were more Bahamian and Afro-Caribbean teachers in the school system at St. John's. I was excited to be a part of a move, an actual movement of teachers who themselves were raised in colonial Bahamas or raised in the colonial Caribbean. But for some reason, these people, these men and women of the day, they were extremely committed to making certain that the persons of my years in St. John's were going to be ready for the world, that we were going to be exposed to the rigors of science and mathematics, that we were going to have a different kind of experience. And we had a lot of Afrocentric experiences and discussions. I learned about Derek Walcott and V.S. Naipaul and Chinua Achebe in St. John's. But the thing is that the timing of when I learned these things was extremely important. You see, my parents still spent money to send me to go and see the Queen. So I had the AIFS trip to London back in 9th grade before or after BJC's. And then it was not until after I finished my O-levels in English literature did I actually get any level of exposure to what was happening in the literature space in the Caribbean region, which seemed a little bit odd, but I still enjoyed the conversation, still enjoyed the discussions, and still carry those lessons with me until today. But the question that I needed to find out deep in myself was that even after I left St. John's, spent a little bit of time at COB, colonialism still was immersed in me. And the reason I know it was immersed in me was because when I hit university in Ohio, thought I was ready for the world, had my GCO levels packed, suitcases full of sweaters from Sawgrass Mills in Florida, ready to go ahead and hit my time in Ohio. And then I met students from the wider diaspora. And then I became silenced. Me, with all of my words and personality, became silenced because I recognized I knew very little about their cultural lived experiences because of where I'm from. And I had to quickly get into a position of real learning. So while my first degree is in engineering, I had to take a break from differential equations and other topics that were really core to my engineering curriculum and had to really dive into history and understand that my history that I was taught was extremely European, was extremely a little bit of Asian, but very Eurocentric. I knew very little about what was happening in Nigeria, knew almost nothing about what had happened in Liberia, knew nothing about what was happening in Cote d'Ivoire or in any other part of the continent. The only thing that I did know was that Nelson Mandela came to COB when I was there. So yeah, I knew a little bit of something, but I didn't know a whole lot. And that experience left me feeling a little bit saddened. I recognize that, I'm here to learn because this is what university is about. But I also recognize that nowhere in my study of at QC or St. John's or even at COB was I really and truly ready for the world. But listen, don't be sad, because trust and believe, I am a lifelong student. And if there's one thing I'm going to do, I'm going to come out swinging, because again, please remember, I was born and raised in Chippenham. So we're going to come out swinging. So when you feel I had a slight deficiency, I spend time studying. But I spend time not just studying, I spend time breaking bread. I spend time listening to people. I spend time engaging with them on classroom assignments and in social clubs. I spent time going to every possible party with somebody who was of a different culture. I went to the Caribbean stuff too, but I also went to all the Liberian and all the Nigerian and anybody who's having a party from anybody from in the continent or from around the continent, from around the entire diaspora. I was there for a good time because I wanted to learn what their experiences were. And I also was very curious about any kind of commonality. And what I learned was something that was beyond profound. You see, I told you about my grandfathers. I told you a little bit about my parents. Told you something about my experience, but who I didn't tell you about was the ladies who I learned from the most. You see, I have a PhD, but the lessons that I learned the most did not come from my dissertation, did not even come from QC St. John's COB undergrad or graduate school. The lessons that were most important to my emotional quotient and today's level of social quotient, my social skills, came from the knees of my Grammy and my Grandma Wallace. My Grammy is Ruth Louise Poitier Clark. She was born and raised in Adelaide and raised to Ruperdene Lane. My other Grammy, Grandma Wallace, is Elizabeth Blanche Ingram Wallace. She came all the way from Inagua and came to Nassau as a teenager. But those women did not attend school beyond second grade. They were hardworking, they were resourceful, they were resilient. They made life happen out of just some flour and some overripe dough. Overripe fruit was their thing. I am nowhere near as culinary skilled as those women were. But I did learn from them the importance of not taking the last hand in a soup, as they call it in Liberia, a susu. I did learn from these ladies the importance of picking pigeon peas before they turn bad, and then using them same pigeon peas and even soaking them in a little bit of water so they could get real plump. And then you add in some onions and some celery, and it eventually can become a pot of pigeon peas and rice. But I also learned from my friends in Ohio that is the same mixture that they call Ankara in Abuja, like Nigeria, as well as in Ghana. I also learned from my grandmothers and my mommy too, the importance of putting on coconut oil to make certain that as you mature, that your skin stays and remains flawless. And if you guys can see me, I have on the jewelry that I learned from my grandmother, that more is more. And so to me, throughout my wildest dreams, I never would have recognized how important being in a decolonized environment is to the entire person. You see, academics, the rigors of reading, writing, and arithmetic are so essential to get you to the next level of life. But it's the lessons that we learn from our ancestors, the journey, those muscle memories that we've heard of early on today, those memories, those stories that perhaps are lost in history, perhaps those stories that were not necessarily told in wider audience, in open spaces, but those stories are the stories of decolonization. And unfortunately, when you are in a school system that is focused and really founded and grounded in colonization, those stories have very little, if any, place at all. Remember, I began my education in the Bahamas at Queens College, where with my hair braided today, I would not necessarily have been as welcomed. I went into St. John's primarily because I had a lot more friends from my community in Chippenham and a whole lot of friends from my church in St. Mary's Church who were at St. John's. And so I felt as a brown-skinned girl, I was going to be more comfortable in that space. And I did learn a whole lot. I excelled. I recognized that while my mother was discouraged from mathematics and sciences, I was encouraged to be one of the only girls to recognize that physics was my jam. And so too is differential equations, my topic of choice. And so today I am, as you heard earlier, a change agent. I've been in a number of organizations throughout the region. I've also had a lot of opportunities to change the culture and change the narrative simply because I've oftentimes been the only. I've oftentimes been the only female. I've oftentimes been the only person in my generation, maybe the only person of color, and certainly the only immigrant. But it's okay because I came from a tiny dot on the map. And that means that I stand on the shoulders of so many others who survived and thrived colonization. And they taught me a few tricks of the trade to make certain that in my targeted approach to decolonization, that we do better with the next generation. And so today, I believe that knowledge is power. And the future of the Bahamian educational system rests on the free flow of information. Today's discussion is just one more example of how we share freely information. And so to ensure that the information that not only honors and celebrates what it means to be Bahamian, we must take a targeted approach to confront and challenge colonized practices that have influenced education of the past and still may be present today. In yesterday's discussion, there was a lot of heated debate about beating and the curriculum. Because I also went to St. John's and Queens College, I believe the disparity of thought is what is happening in the public school systems and what is happening in the private and parochial school systems. There may be some disparity, but we need to get on the same page. I believe that since culture is an outward expression of who we are as a people and commonly expressed in our food, in our language, the way we walk into the room, the way we choose certain words or do not choose certain words, the way we even express ourselves in fashion, and simply the way that we move. We need to truly decolonize our educational school systems from pre-K through tertiary by allowing people to freely be who they are. There were discussions yesterday about the curls on someone's hair and whether afros or a natural hairstyle is appropriate or even embraced and celebrated in the school systems. I can tell you in my St. John's years, if your hair wasn't fried, dyed, and laid to the side, you was talked about. That was just not a thing.
Michelle?
But yes.
You missed our notes in the chat, so you had a 5-minute warning. Now you're down to a 0-minute warning. So just to let
Thank
you know,
you.
please. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. My final statement is, as a Bahamian of the wider diaspora, I want to make certain that we are a part of the conversation, that we're not here just to present and to participate. We're here to do some work. And so I speak for myself, absolutely, but there are others from around the wider diaspora who are eager and intentional about making certain that the changes that are necessary for the Bahamas in any space, we're here for the journey. I want to say a thank you to the University of the Bahamas, especially your technical department. Thank you for bearing with me. For my fellow panelists, thank you for being a part of the conversation with me. And for anything else, I'm here for the conversation. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker will be, in light of the issues we're having with the video, we will have the pre-recorded version of the next speaker and the following one. So, and then we'll have questions. The 3 speakers are still online, so we'll be able to still engage with some conversation afterwards. So I'll introduce then Reverend Dr. Carlton John Turner. Okay. Reverend Dr. Carlton Turner is an Anglican priest and Caribbean contextual theologian working at the Queen's Foundation in the UK. His PhD thesis was published in 2020 entitled Overcoming Self-Negation, John Canoe and the Church in Contemporary Bahamian Society. He is currently working on a textbook on Caribbean contextual theology. Carlton is a native of Andros, growing up in the Mangrove Cree area. He formerly worked as a Spanish teacher before training for the priesthood and pursuing his postgraduate studies in theology. Today, his title is Ecclesiastical Contestations. Whoa, okay. I'll put that along with colonialism. I obviously didn't get that one right, eh? So ecclesiastical contestations, narratives of God in post-colonial Bahamian society.
Good morning, all, and it is a pleasure to be here, all the way from the UK, and I want to say thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this Color, Class, and Colonialism conference. And because we're short on time, I'll get right into my presentation. I have a title, Ecclesiastical Contestations, Narratives of God in Post-Colonial Bahamian Society. J. Emmett Ware's Let Us Build a Christian Nation is perhaps the most significant published text on Christianity in the Bahamas in light of its emergence as an independent Christian nation. Ware uses the ecumenical backdrop of Christianity in the Bahamas to theologically reflect on what it means to be a Bahamian Christian, considering the impact of British colonization, and North American neoliberal imperialism. There is a sense in which Christianity in the Bahamas is not monolithic, still emerging, and deeply shaped by global superpowers such as the United States and Great Britain, a fact that is seldom articulated in religious discourse. My paper seeks to do the following. Firstly, I want to explore another complex dimension of ecclesiastical relations in the nation stemming directly from its colonial beginnings. Secondly, it is, as in the case of the rest of the region, the ongoing contest between official ecclesiastical bodies or denominations and the often marginalized religious traditions such as Obeah and Jonkanu. Yes, I'll be talking about Obeah in a minute. So firstly, I want to look at Jonkanu as a tale of identity, which Nicolette Bethel talks about and phrases it in this way. And secondly, Obeah as a tale of shadows. Here's an overall question I have for anyone listening. Could it be that this centuries-old contest for religious legitimacy along the African-European axis continues to take place in the contemporary post-colonial Bahamas? By the mid-18th century, British sugar plantations were doing very well, revolutionized by African slave labor. The Church of England in these colonies remained undisturbed from other ecclesiastical bodies, and its outlook on African enslavement can best be described by Arthur C. Dayford as follows. It is the darkest blot upon the history of the established church in the West Indies in this era is its failure to do anything effective about the welfare, either physical or spiritual, of the slaves. Cartwright Davis and Noel Erskine placed the development of the church in the Caribbean into 4 phases, ranging from a colonial church imposing upon the indigenous peoples to an indigenous church arising from the people themselves. And it is this latter phase which still proves difficult for the church, particularly the Anglican Church. What we are discussing is a history of colonial trauma within the region, a trauma that affects the history of every Caribbean nation, including the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, before, during, and after independence exercises. At the heart of this colonial trauma is a deeply embedded and complex contestation between post-Enlightenment European rationalism, with all its racist and patronizing assumptions, steeped within the structures of missionary Christianity, and the resilience of the African traditional religious heritages amidst the traumatic legacies of enslavement and colonialism. Any nuanced investigation into the contemporary religiosity in the post-independence Bahamas must take account of this reality. Let's return to Ware's account, an analysis of the genesis of the newly independent nation. Reflecting on the prophet Nehemiah in the 5th century BCE, post-Babylonian Jewish nation, Ware argues that the Commonwealth of the Bahamas in 1973 was constructed under Christian values and designed to be a Christian nation. He lists the architects of the newly independent nation, praising their continuation towards preserving the importance of national sovereignty and these Christian values. Names include Reverend Dr. Reuben Cooper Sr., Reverend Dr. Harcourt Whitfield Brown, Reverend Dr. Edwin Llewellyn Taylor, Reverend Father Joseph Perner, Archdeacon William Thompson, Reverend Dr. Hervis Bain, Reverend Dr. Philip Ramming, Dr. Rex Oral Major, Bishop Michael Eldon, Reverend Carlton E. Francis, among others. Included among the many contributors from across the various denominational traditions, he also highlights those who have gained international success. Dr. Miles Monroe, Bishop Neil Ellis, and Bishop Godfrey Williams as examples. However, when surveying the rest of Ware's important theological and historical contribution to the development of Christianity in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, his concern is with a credible theology that is contextually Bahamian. His love for the Bahamas and its potential for a potent and effective form of Christianity is evident. His perspective of Bahamian ecclesiastical life is framed by his theological orientation as a liberation theologian. Javon O'Neely has written some 12 years later as a Bahamian theologian and practitioner, deeply concerned about the nation, and reflects on this from his Black and political theological tradition. His book, Different Directions, Bold Beginnings, Race, Religion, and Renewal, also takes on the concept of the nation. His work is wide-ranging and seeks to explore many of the complex issues facing the Bahamas in contemporary life. And let me offer you an excerpt from the book. The majority rule era and the independence movement are part of a continuous tradition of progression and resistance in Black Bahamian life. The majority rule era was based on the notion that the realization of equality and justice for Blacks, their progress, liberties, and their ability to govern themselves could advance the country and not set it backwards. Independence, likewise, was to give voice to the world that the Bahamas was moving forward, for the world to see this young country as politically strong and economically stable. However, I would argue that Ware's approach, as well as Neely's, though they bring together in-depth reflections on key Bahamian ecclesiastical figures from independence to the contemporary period, needs a deeper analysis of the ecclesiastical history of the Bahamas. The deepest contestation of all is that missionary Christianity, in some guise, and African traditional religious heritages, or African Bahamian cultural and religious heritages in some form or the other, have not progressed as harmoniously as we tend to think. I suggest that a post-colonial, or specifically a post-colonial theological lens, might help with this. While a liberationist approach, as per Ware, or a Black theological approach, as per Neely, are helpful, when thinking of identity, a deeper post-colonial dive is needed. I am employing a post-colonial theological optic to argue my point. I'm concerned not simply with justice and liberation, but the substructures of how colonial systems work, how they proceed, and how they shape the very exercise of theology itself. I have also articulated this in a journal article that was published in Modern Theology here in the UK, in a special edition on post-colonialism and theology, where I argue colonization and empire are complex phenomena. And we would do well to frame the concept of colonialism as multiple, multifaceted, multi-generational, multi-perceptual, and multiply enacted. In other words, any kind of post-colonial critique must constantly evolve and tease out the nuances of contemporary life. Let's look at religion in the Bahamas. The Bahamas has a colonial past and is shaped by coloniality. Whether we're talking pre-independence or post, the prevailing attitude towards the Black Bahamian population and their culture, usually by English persons, especially missionaries and tourists, and latterly by Black Bahamians themselves, reveals that there has been a persistent disparagement of African traditional religious and cultural ways. For example, let's take, I had this experience of sitting down in a meeting at Canterbury Cathedral, the seat of the English Church, And I was talking about missionary Christianity and the issues around how that affected Caribbean life. And by chance, I picked up a book, and this book was by the Reverend G.C. Rollins, one-time Anglican missionary to the Bahamas in 1920. This is what he writes. No doubt, the more terrible cases of witchcraft are very rare, but it does not follow that these are entirely unknown. In the Black Republic of Haiti, it seems certain that criminal practices are resorted to and children murdered for nefarious ends. Within the last 20 or 30 years, children have also vanished in the Bahamas, though notwithstanding grave suspicion, it has never been possible to prove anything. The religion of the Bahamian Negro is Christian, but sometimes it is Christianity in its most debased form. And many of the beliefs and practices flourish like nettles side by side with it. Putting aside the despicable hubris of Reverend G.C. Rollins, to which any Bahamian would want to react vehemently, there is a point to tease out. Certainly the church in the Bahamas is not just one thing, since we have emerged with many different denominations with varying degrees of legitimacy and power within the nation. Digging more deeply into the roots, R-O-O-T-S and R-O-U-T-E-S, of Christianity in the country, reveals a perennial tension at the heart of ecclesiastical life. That is the complex and tense relationship between African Bahamian culture and various forms of missionary Christianity. Christianity, like Bahamian dialect, is complex and diverse and cannot be divorced from African Bahamian cultural heritages. To speak of religion in the Bahamas is to speak of a highly complex and dialectical relationship between various identities within Bahamian cultural and religious life. We are never just one thing. Bahamian identity is fluid, internally active, and I would suggest, theologically speaking, and because of our colonial heritage, we inhabit multiple worlds that aren't necessarily consonant. We, in many ways, live dissonant lives. Now let's turn our attention to the two examples of this inner conflict within Bahamian religious and ecclesiastical identity. The first is Junkanoo, a tale of identity. Nicolette Bethel's navigation of Bahamian cultural identity in her research on Junkanoo is invaluable, noting the dialectical relationship involved in the festival and the multiple ways in which it functions to help us see that there is a fluidity and an impermanence to Bahamian identity. Nonetheless, Bethel gives us perhaps the most vivid description of how Junkanoo functions as a means of socio-political critique, one that is replete with what I am describing as a contestation. Junkanoo, she says, has the quality of an occupation, an invasion of the centers of authority. It occurs at the heart of the commercial power of white Bahamian elite. This symbolism is still implicit in the parades. Although today we follow a circular route, Bahamians still refer metonymously to the act of attending or participating in the parade as going to Bay Street. The focus of anti-Black discrimination, the site of legislation, and the heart of commerce. And until 1998, the subversion of the everyday state of affairs was emphasized by the fact that the Junkanoo parade ran counter to the normal one-way traffic system of the downtown area. Due to the complex post-colonial nature of Bahamian identity and drawing on the work of Michael Hertzfield, Timothy Roman asserts that Junkanoo music functions as a particularly powerful mechanism of cultural intimacy. Roman explains it as an ongoing process through which the paradoxes and complexities of collective representation and self-recognition are negotiated in the modern nation state. However, while Roman explores Junkanoo using ethnomusicological lenses, Kenneth Bilby reminds us that the anthropologists and scholars of Junkanoo have attributed secularity to the festival in ways that were not warranted. He relocates Junkanoo and he calls it Jankunu, Jankunu, within its African traditional religious Mayalist roots, reminding us that there is also and always a dialogue, perhaps even a contestation, going on between African Bahamian ancestral religious and spiritual roots and their contemporary presentations of identity, including their religiosity. He states, today in the transformed Jankanoo that has survived and still is with us, there is still more than meets the eye, encoded and carried down to us in secular yet sacred sounds to which, masked as ever, the spirit still dances. In my own research into Junkanoo, I suggest that coloniality has shaped the nation significantly, and such shaping manifests in the Junkanoo parade in different ways. Bahamians are, irrespective of their denominational allegiance, navigating a pervasive dissonance between their faith and their culture. Secondly, Obeah, A Tale of Shadows. The Bahamas Handbook of 1989 records a piece on Obeah entitled To Obeah or Not to Obeah, Curses, Coffins, and Cash. It points to the legal penalization of the practice throughout Bahamian history and the place this African traditional religious heritage, though villainized, is deeply intertwined within the Bahamian psyche. Like most of the English-speaking Caribbean, it remains a criminal offense on the law books, and naturally, it is equally stigmatized. At the same time, historically within the English colonies, it has demanded significant respect because of its effectiveness in contesting colonial and plantation violence, and also securing practical resolve of familial and social disputes. The volume of the Bahamas Handbook records the following testimony. Jenny, a 60-year-old retired waitress, told of reading the Psalm 109 40 years ago when her brother threatened to throw her out of the family home at Cat Island. Her brother John, the eldest of a family of 8, was trying to get legal possession of their deceased father's property. Tired of abuses hurled at her, Jenny decided to put a stop to her anguish. Says Jenny, I visited the Obeah man in our settlement and asked him to fix or put a spell on my brother for being so cruel and unfair to me. The old man listened to my story and told me to go home and read the 109th Psalm at 6 a.m. for 3 days straight. After reading the Psalm, I was instructed to turn the Bible upside down over a 6-pence silver coin that became obsolete in 1966 when the Bahamas switched to the decimal currency. I felt scared reading the Psalm for my brother. I really did. On the third morning, as I was going to end my reading, I heard cries coming from the area of the beach. I found out later that my brother, John, and 2 of his friends drowned during the night when their fishing boat capsized. Jenny broke into tears as she continued to recount a tale that has taunted her for nearly 50 years. Another excerpt from this volume that I want to record here is a quote from the infamous Tony McKay, Exuma the Obeah man. He states, if you take away your Junkanoo and Obeah, then you will be taking away a good piece of our culture. These things are here to stay with us. I would argue that Exuma is right. And when engaging in any research into Junkanoo or Obeah in the Bahamas, no matter how discouraged that might be, we are dealing with cultural and religious identity. In this sense, we are engaging with the deep substructures of Bahamian psyche And at these substructures, there seems to be, and no doubt have always been, a contestation between our missionary Christian heritage and our multiple and complex African traditional religious and cultural ancestry. These have not been harmonious, and they play out in contemporary social and cultural life, generation after generation. And let me press this a bit further. I want to suggest that the concept of the shadow in analytic psychology, take, for example, the work of Carl Jung. For Jung, the shadow consists of all the unconscious material in our lives that we repress, the good, the bad, and that we can no longer see. And within a Jungian framework, the person or the self is not a singular reality. The human person is made up of the ego, who they think they are, the persona, the mask that they present for others to see, and the shadow, the part that they can't see, but that others often do. Psychopathological conditions occur when these aspects of the self are out of alignment. Could it be that something similar is taking place within the archetypical Bahamian self? Could it be the case that there is a misalignment and that the African traditional religious heritages have become part of the shadow, and things that are part of the shadow are always presented as strange or alien? And in many cases, it is re-presented to ourselves as evil. In this manner, then, the same Obeah that we suppress into the subconscious or into the hinterland of our religious and cultural landscape will always resurge stronger, more surprising, more shocking, more scary. To help with this, I want to invoke somebody who I think most Bahamians need to read, and it's Tim McCartney's 10:10, the Bible 10. Timothy McCartney presents us with an invaluable text tracing the history and significance of Obeah in Bahamian society. What makes his work particularly significant is that McCartney is a psychiatrist as well as an authority on Obeah. He shows how Obeah practitioners did not simply disappear. They integrated into the key institutions of Bahamian society, such as the churches, Masonic lodges, and they evolved to become less European-led and more Black-led. And McCartney is careful not to assess Christianity and Obeah in the Bahamas as binary opposites, noting how, if we're honest, Obeah practitioners do their own hermeneutical engagement with key biblical texts and Christian traditions. In a way, the Obeah man or woman is not anti-Bible nor anti-Christian. He or she is anti-powerlessness and oppression. There is fluid, dialectical, and complex relationship between Obeah and Christianity that we cannot dismiss. The emphasis on power in the theology of the Obeah practitioner must be understood within its historical context. Obeah was shaped within the context of plantation slavery and became prominent to the point of being outlawed, not because it was evil, but because it was effective. And within the legal theological power matrix of plantation society, church and state converged to maintain control over the imaginations of the enslaved and their descendants. Roseanne Adderley reminds us that the anti-Obeah laws across the Anglophone Caribbean were based on the idea that African-derived religious activities and cultures were pagan and therefore were antithetical to Christianity. This dichotomous and colonially constructed notion of sinfulness must be seen as fundamental to the Bahamian religious and cultural experience, where church and colonial power, particularly the Anglican Church, have largely been synonymous historically. However, the religious and theological imagination behind Obeah, the works of healing, command of the spirits, and even the abilities to cause harm by ritual or spiritual means is nothing new to the Bible or Christianity. Let me end with these sets of statements. I've explored aspects of Bahamian national, religious, and cultural identity to make the following set of observations or conclusions. Firstly, Bahamian national, cultural, and religious identity are incredibly complex. And as per psychoanalytic insights into the self, processes of identity are dynamic and very much hidden. Secondly, while we are in an independent nation 50 years on, and we know the architects of the modern Bahamas, many of whom are iconic ecclesial personalities, being a sovereign independent nation does not mean wholeness or consonance within national, cultural, and religious identity. Thirdly, when more deeply considering our national conversation around our religious identities and the ways in which we perform or inhabit our African traditional religious heritages and our missionary Christian heritages, there is a pervasive contestation or dissonance. In short, 50 years after independence, the Bahamas is a Christian nation. But what kind of Christians are the Bahamians? I'm suggesting that there is still a conversation to be had in this regard, one that has never quite taken place. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker and final for this session is Dr. Virgil Storr. Virgil Henry Storr is the Vice President of Academic and Student Programs at the McCantus Center, a Professor of Economics in the Department of Economics, George Mason University, and a Senior Fellow at the F.A. Hayek Program in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, George Mason University. He holds a PhD in economics from George Mason University and did his undergraduate work at Bella College in Wisconsin. Prior to joining George Mason, Virgil was the Chief Information Officer for TSD Communications, a communications strategy firm specializing in crisis communications, speech writing, media, training, and communications technology. Born and raised in the Bahamas, Virgil now lives in Virginia with his wife, Nona Martin Storr, and his daughter, Winnie. Ladies and gentlemen, his topic today is Bahamians are a resilient people.
Hey, good day. I'm so glad that I get an opportunity to speak to you. I'd wished I was able to speak to you in person, but unfortunately I'm not able to. But today I want to talk about Bahamians as a resilient people. That I'll try to offer a cleaner definition in a bit of what I mean by resilience. But for now, it's useful to think about individual resilience, community resilience, that it's having something to do with an ability to prepare for, to survive, to respond to bounce back from some challenge. In our 50 years as a nation and the hundreds of years since Columbus landed, Bahamians have been confronted with challenge after challenge, obstacle after obstacle, and have frequently exhibited a capacity to overcome them and to come back stronger. For instance, a majority of the country descends from people who were enslaved. Unlike slavery everywhere, slavery in the Bahamas was a brutal institution. You crack open any history book of Bahamian history, and you get a vivid picture of just how awful slavery in the Bahamas was. But Bahamian Blacks not only survived that, but their descendants are thriving. Similarly, a majority of Bahamians had suffered from the apartheid system that lasted at least until majority rule in the country. And again, Bahamians not only survived those frequent injustices, but Bahamians have gone on to thrive. Indeed, one way to understand the 1942 riot, which signaled a political awakening of Bahamian Blacks, along with the general strike in '58 or Black Tuesday, which made it clear that the white merchant elite could no longer dominate the majority Black population, at least not indefinitely, One way to understand the move to majority rule and independence are as examples of Bahamian resistance, but also as evidence of Bahamian resilience. In fact, my confidence in the Bahamians' ability to deal with the challenges of tomorrow, and there will be many, is because Bahamians have, over the course of our histories, demonstrated that we can overcome challenges, that we are resilient. Today, I want to focus on the challenge of dealing with natural hazards, with disasters, in particular with hurricanes, because these crisis events are becoming more extreme and becoming more frequent. And because Bahamians are a resilient people and have shown such resilience in the face of these kinds of disasters. But let's begin with definitions. How is it that communities prepare for, respond to, recover from catastrophes like hurricanes? The way I think about it has Tocquevillian roots. Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America talked about the associational capacity of community members, their ability to work together to accomplish small and big things. Tocqueville thought they were linked, that the art and science of association was a thing that had to be learned, developed, nurtured, cultivated. And the way that you learn it was by working together to solve essentially small challenges. A little bit more on this later. Douglas Patton, noted disaster study scholar, has defined resilience as societies and citizens' ability to draw upon their individual, collective, and institutional resources and competencies to anticipate, cope with, adapt to, recover from, and learn from the demands, challenges, and changes encountered before, during, and after disaster. Judith Rodin in The Resilience Dividend has said, resilience is the capacity of an entity or individual, community, an organization, or a natural system to prepare for disruptions, to recover from shocks and stresses, and to adapt and grow from a disruptive experience. As you build resistance, therefore, you become more able to prevent or mitigate stresses and shocks, and that you can identify, and better able to respond to those that you can't predict or avoid. According to the United States' National Center for Disaster Preparedness, the most resilient communities are those communities with a greater capacity, as defined by their ability to access human, social, political, and economic capital, and greater capabilities in developing, acquiring, and exchanging these resources. There's a sense in which this must be true, in the same way that saying stronger people can lift more, in some sense, must be true. But the question is how communities develop these capacities. How do communities become resilient? What makes them better or worse at preparing for, responding to, and importantly, recovering from disasters? Why are Bahamians, for instance, if my thesis is correct, so resilient? Before that, as I hinted at before, this is a particularly important question because disasters, hurricanes in particular, are happening more and becoming worse. The World Meteorological Organization has said that there was reported that there have been more than 11,000 reported disasters with just over 2 million deaths and causing 3.64 trillion in losses over the last 50 years. And although over that time we've seen some changes, the number of deaths have decreased, the economic losses associated with these disasters have increased by sevenfold. And the Bahamas has had more than its fair share of major hurricanes. This is just a sampling. There are a ton of advantages the Bahamians enjoy simply by virtue of geography. Amazing beaches, beautiful climate, proximity to the United States, our ability to, as Professor Strawn has written in his book from years ago, our ability to engage in and leverage a brochure discourse, through which we get to sell the Bahamas as paradise. But there are also disadvantages. And perhaps the chief geographic disadvantage is that every year during hurricane season, there's a possibility that we will end up in the path of a hurricane that might, if the winds are strong enough and the storm surge high enough, radically impact our lives. The Bahamas, as I said, has had a history of hurricanes over the last 100 years that have destroyed lives and property. And it's just like getting a sampling in 1926, almost all the homes in Great Exuma were destroyed by the 1926, it's called the Nassau hurricane. Significant destruction in Eleuthera, Cat Island, Berry Island, Bimini, Andros, and then significant flooding and damage in Nassau. The Hurricane Betsy in 1965 followed the same track as the 1929 hurricane that caused so much damage in Nassau. With Betsy, the eye wall stalled just north of Nassau, causing 10 feet of storm surges that swept through Bay Street. And as you'll recall, the damage done by Hurricane Andrew and the more recent hurricanes, Floyd, Michelle, Francis, Irene, Matthew, Dorian, been significant. And more recently, Hurricane Dorian was perhaps the worst yet. Inarguably, in some sense, the worst yet. With winds of 185 miles an hour, it parked over the northern Bahamas on September 1st, 2019. It was amongst the most damaging hurricanes to affect the country. The rain, wind, flooding, and storm surge was high as 7 feet in some areas, caused over 3.4 billion in damage, and left as much as 70,000 homeless in Abaco and Grand Bahama, many of whom were forced to leave those islands. Indeed, the damage was significant, and the challenge of bouncing back from it is immense. And so the question is, how did it recover from this disaster? There's actually reason. How the communities in general recover from disasters? There are reasons, in fact, to doubt that communities would or even could ever recover from a disaster like a hurricane. One reason is that disaster recovery is a massive collective action problem. The terms used in economics, what it means is that it's a circumstance where if we could all cooperate, we would all be better off. If we could all figure out a way to work together, we would all be better off. But where it's in none of our individual interests to contribute to the joint effort until we're sure that everybody else will contribute. And so it's a circumstance where, in the case of a hurricane, where the costs of rebuilding are extremely high, that rebuilding a home that's been completely destroyed takes money, takes time. There's a psychic toll of picking through the damage and destroyed keepsake. The opportunity cost of rebuilding in an Abaco or Grand Bahama, when you could be building a new life for yourself in St. Nassau. But while the cost of rebuilding are extremely high, the benefits of rebuilding are at best uncertain. And why uncertain? Because there's so many questions that you don't actually have answers to when you're making the decision about whether or not to return. That building a home, you don't know, for instance, before you're building a home, you don't know, for instance, what the community will be like in 2, 3, 5, 10 years. But you don't know which business opportunities will exist. You don't know what public services will be available. You don't know what disruptive social networks will be restored and which ones won't. You don't know who else is going to return and rebuild. Will my church or social clubs or the businesses that I frequent, will they come back or not? Will my neighbors come back? In the worst of storm, whether it harmed the family or not, the harder to know what the community will look like after the recovery period. And so the rational move, the sensible move, the smart move for anybody in that kind of situation where the benefits of doing something are at best uncertain and the costs are really high, is to wait and see. To wait and see who will come back first and what the community will be like before making the decision to return. Another way to put that in economic ease is that the risk associated with being a first mover could be prohibitive. And the collective action problem after Dorian seemed particularly pronounced, not only because of the level of damage, but because of the number of people who were displaced from both Grand Bahama and Abaco. But parts of Grand Bahama and Abaco are recovering, well on their way to recovery. And so how is that? How did that happen? Because it's a thing that should not have happened. And the reason it happened is because Bahamians are resilient people. And where do we get our resilience from? Well, some of it of resilience can be taught, or rather had to be learned the hard way. Resilient communities generally that have faced hardship before and weathered it. They figured out a way through it. So my grandmother, when she was alive, would tell the story of the 1929 hurricane that hit much of the Bahamas and causing significant damage in Nassau when she was just an 11-year-old growing up. She talked about it ripping off the roof, talked about being trapped in the home, she would talk about the storm surge, sort of coming onto shore, having to escape in a boat with her older sibling. But that hurricane, as devastating as it was, as horrible as it was, is a thing, as frightening as it must have been for an 11-year-old girl to face, is a thing that shaped who she became as a person. She went on to grow into being one of the strongest people that I've ever met. And it's her strength and her resilience that sort of gained in part because of that carried her through. So her strength and resilience was able to calm me as a young boy, our grandson, as I was sort of, looking out, worrying about, say, Hurricane David in 79, what it might do to the country. And so there's reason to be hopeful about the North Bahamas. There's always been reason to be hopeful because, in part, because it's a place that had been affected and damaged by Hurricane Francis and Hurricane Matthew sometime before. And so Bahamians from the islands learned the hard way how to meet the moment. That in some sense, in a negative sense, the past trauma had prepared them to deal with the future trauma. But luckily, resilience doesn't have to always be learned the hard way. It can also be learned by solving smaller and more manageable challenges. Resilient communities are also communities that practice resilience. And so this is also part of the Bahamian story. Because it's not just that we've dealt with hard things in the past and can deal with hard things in the future, but it's that we actually, have a history of communities that work together and have worked together in the past and can deal with practiced in solving small challenges, and so are prepared to deal with bigger ones as they occur. And so resilience there is just not just something that happens to communities. It's not just a character trait or an endowment. It's something that you learn over time. To return to Tocqueville, Tocqueville would say, we learn to be citizens in political laboratories. We work with our neighbors to sort out how to deal with some particular problem. There's an elderly person in our community that needs help if they're gonna make a go of it. And as a community, we figure out ways to work together to deal with that. We work with members in say congregations to make sure that the hungry in our congregation get fed. And that practice prepares us for when something so truly awful, something more significantly awful occurs. And so when you when we see Bahamians organizing to help or to raise money for a family member who's sick, or you see us working together in our church groups or Kiwanis clubs or lodges, or has occurred frequently in the past, at least, where you see us participating in things like ACU. We're practicing resilience. We're gaining the strength to prepare us to deal with these bigger problems down the road. And so something like Operation Feed's Need, that was sort of conducted by the New Providence Community Church, who was, fed as many as 800 displaced residents, citizens of Abaco and Grand Bahama during the sort of the weeks and months following Dorian. That's able to succeed because that church had practiced resilience, had developed a capacity to work together to meet much smaller needs, much less extreme needs in the past. And so our resilience as Bahamians is both hard-earned and cultivated by a propensity of Bahamians to associate with one another. And so it's that propensity to associate, if we're going to meet the challenges of tomorrow, the Bahamians have to hold on to. Thanks so much.
This is more of a comment, I guess. I remember every time I heard the word resilience, I was cringing. Because I remember when Cuban Menace he kept on saying that to us while literally doing the most egregious or committing the egregious kinds of acts towards the Bahamian citizenry. I remember when he kept on saying that, in particular when, I don't know if everybody remember when he made the statement, sometimes governments have to do illegal or something he said. I can't remember what he said. Break the Constitution. Yes, thank you, Don. They have to break the Constitution in order. This is during the lockdown, right? Sometimes governments have to break the Constitution in order to do something. I can't remember what he said. Thank you. Yes. Thank you. That's exactly what he said. And he said this on national television in the House of Assembly. And so I have I don't like that word because I think about the neoliberalist policies and behaviors that come out of those policies that they use to inflict on poor people, black people, marginalized people. And he kept on saying this while he was doing the worst kinds of things as prime minister, right? And nobody was checking him in the cabinet. And I just remember thinking, like, because of him to keep doing that, he kept on saying this. I know that I know that things are hard. I know that things are rough. And I guess Stark could talk to this, is the neoliberalization of resilience. Is that you use that as a means of saying, oh, we could do this to them. They could take it because they're resilient. And it's that kind of attitude that I saw not only with, not just with Menace, but you see some of that happening now even with Davis. He's doing it more covertly, right? Yeah, covertly. But it's there. And I don't want to be resilient. How about y'all just be decent human beings and stop doing what you're doing to us? Then we wouldn't have to be resilient. Then I wouldn't have to overcome nothing, right? If there are no barriers, if you take the barriers down and do what you've been elected to do, we wouldn't have to be continuously saying, oh, Bahamian people are resilient. Stop it. We don't want to be resilient. We just want to exist. We want to live, you know?
You,
it's the same amount of pain. And whenever that word itself is telling me that my suffering is not recognized. You're not acknowledging my suffering. My suffering it's almost like when they compare slavery to the Holocaust. I hate it. Don't do that. You can't do those kinds of things, you know? So that's it. I have a question for Turn, I think it is. Would you equate, huh? I don't know.
Store, are you able to respond?
Probably, I don't know, but the question was, does he equate, he spoke of liberation theology, and I want to know if he's equating that also with social justice theology.
Yeah. Tur- is that really for Turner or for Store? For Turner, yes. All right. Turner, are you able to respond? Okay. All right. Well, we have another, in the interest of time, we'll go to the other question on the floor, please.
Is this on? Okay, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Okay, my question is, well, it's a question. It's to the idea, the comment about the benefits of Reconstruction are uncertain. It did make sense after that was explained. I didn't understand that at first, but I do still have a question to that. So Freeport here, right? It's like the second city, and Nassau is the first. But Nassau is a pretty terrible city, to be honest. Like it's so bad they have to use it to refer to the whole island to make it seem like a city. Meanwhile, Freeport has been destroyed by a hurricane. So given that this, the capitalist engine is, failing, and Freeport's, the city is in the wake of, the wrath of a climate crisis, then should the efforts be done to sort of rebuild the second city? That sounds bad, but that's my question.
Panelists? Do we have confirmed audio from the panelists? Like, are they actually able to unmute and communicate with us? Okay, fair enough. All right. It just helps me not to expect a response right now. Yeah. Give them a chance to see you. Give them a minute. Yeah. So, okay, so we're going to give our tech guys 1 minute just to see if they can resolve this. And if not, then we're going to end. But let's give them a chance, though. Very. Okay.
Hello?
Hello.
Okay. Oh, they must have. Okay, who do we have audio from?
Yeah, this is Carlton.
And Virgil.
Okay, great.
Michelle,
Can they hear us now?
Yes, we can. So,
excellent.
Store, can you also
Carlton,
respond?
This is Virgil. Can you hear me? This is Virgil. Can you hear me?
please.
This is Virgil. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, awesome. So let me just, I think both are really good questions. Let me just try to answer them very, very quickly. Because what I'd hope to say at the end is exactly where the questions were taking me, right? That I think there's two sides to this resilience talk as both the speakers, both the questioners raised, right? One is that as we deal with sort of more and more frequent and extreme hurricanes, yes, but also as we deal with things like a murder rate that's still too high, as we try to overcome things like the economic vulnerability that seems to be certain to preoccupy us for over the next few decades. I do think it is important and it is critical to remember that we are resilient and that our resilience, and this is the important piece, that our resilience comes in part from our frequently connecting with each other to solve problems big and small. And so so if we continue to be a community where we know our neighbors, if we sort of continue to be a place where we come together to do things like John Canoe, as Father Turner was talking about, that we will continue to be a resilient people. As Helen said in her poem from the last session, this is why the old ways were communal. And so that's like a critical part to the piece. But there's a flip side to this, right? That it's not just that um, you know, part of why people are resilient is because they've been catching too much hell, right? That's actually that's a fact. And so although I think it's important for our politicians and clergy and educators and activists and everybody to you know expect and rely on and know that we can be resilient and that they can't do much about something like hurricanes, and so they may need to rely on our resilience, that maybe they can work and should be working together to build a society where things aren't so tough. And so I think that's actually also a critical piece as well, that you don't want that part of the resilience comes from things being bad and people needing to build up the muscles to be able to deal with the stuff that's bad. And so we also want, on the flip side of this, a world where things are less bad.
On the floor also for Turner. Turner, you want to give a quick response, please?
Yes, thank you. You can hear me okay? Yes?
We can.
Okay. To the lady who asked about liberation theology and social justice theology, yeah, I'm talking about the same thing. I mean, liberation theology highlights the need for justice, but the Latin American context isn't the only space and place. So Black theology does the same. Inherently, there is a social justice element when you think about liberation. I hope that answers your question. It was a simple one. I didn't know if you had more, but I would like to say, just give my appreciation in the panel before. My panelists, co-panelists, thank you for what you shared. But the panel before I found really fascinating. So thank you, particularly Helen Colonialism's Jungian and psychoanalytic stuff. When we're dealing with trauma, even though I'm talking from a theological space, the same thing keeps coming up. I don't care if you're Christian, non-Christian, whatever you are, however you self-define, trauma is something that affects us all. But I really enjoyed what I've been hearing today.
Okay. So with that then, I will thank you all for participating in this session. Dr. Wallace Renshaw, Storr, and Turner, thank you. And I'll invite whatever announcements come next.